What you're about to hear will absolutely shatter your heart and make you question everything you think you know about trust, manipulation, and the dangerous secrets that international students hide to survive in America. This is the devastating true story of Arya Mehta, a brilliant 21-year-old computer science student from Mumbai who traveled 8,000 miles to chase her dreams in Florida, only to discover that some arrangements come with a price far more terrifying than she ever imagined. Before I tell you this gut-wrenching story that will leave you speechless and changed forever, make sure you hit that like button because this story deserves to be heard by everyone, and don't forget to subscribe because we bring you the most shocking true stories that expose the dark reality behind perfect social media posts. The scorching Florida sun beat down mercilessly on Gainesville as Arya Mehta stepped off the Greyhound bus clutching her worn duffel bag and a crumpled piece of paper with her dorm address. It was August 18, 2023. And after months of saving every rupee her middle-class family could spare, she had finally made it to the University of Florida to pursue her master's degree in computer science. Arya's father worked double shifts as an accountant in Mumbai while her mother sold homemade pickles to neighbors just to afford her daughter's tuition, and the weight of their sacrifice pressed heavily on her shoulders as she navigated the unfamiliar campus for the first time. At 21, Arya was petite with intelligent dark eyes and long black hair that she usually kept in a practical braid, but her most striking feature was her determination to succeed no matter what obstacles stood in her way. The culture shock hit Arya immediately as she struggled to understand American accents, navigate the complex university bureaucracy, and adjust to a social environment completely different from conservative Mumbai. Her small dorm room felt like a prison compared to the spacious family home she had shared with her parents and younger brother, and the loneliness was overwhelming as she watched American students effortlessly form friendships while she struggled to connect with anyone who understood her background. The food in the dining hall made her stomach ache for her mother's cooking, and the constant noise from parties and social gatherings reminded her how isolated she felt in this new world that seemed designed for people nothing like her. Within weeks, Arya's financial situation became desperately stressful as the reality of American living costs hit her like a sledgehammer. Despite working the maximum hours allowed on her student visa at the campus computer lab, her paycheck barely covered basic necessities like textbooks, laundry, and the occasional decent meal. She watched classmates casually spend money on clothes, entertainment, and restaurant meals that cost more than her weekly food budget, and the constant comparison made her feel like an outsider looking through windows at a life she could never afford. Her parents called every week asking how she was adjusting, and Arya forced cheerful lies about her experience because she couldn't bear to worry them when they had already sacrificed so much to send her to America. The breaking point came in October when Arya's laptop crashed during midterm season, and she didn't have money for repairs that would cost more than 2 months of her campus job salary. She spent 3 desperate days trying to complete coding assignments on library computers with limited hours, watching her grades suffer as she fell behind on projects that required specialized software. The stress gave her panic attacks that left her gasping for breath in bathroom stalls, and she seriously considered dropping out and returning to India in shame rather than continuing to struggle in a system that seemed designed to crush students like her who didn't have family wealth to fall back on. It was during one of these breakdown moments in the campus coffee shop that Richard Sterling first noticed Arya crying over her broken laptop and textbooks spread across a corner table. Richard was a 52-year-old real estate developer who owned several luxury properties in Gainesville and frequently visited the university campus for business meetings and networking events. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and expensive suits, Richard exuded the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of financial success and social connections that opened doors most people never even knew existed. He had built his fortune developing upscale condominiums and shopping centers throughout Central Florida, and his wealth allowed him to indulge his preference for young, ambitious women who reminded him of his own daughter studying abroad in Europe. Richard approached Arya's table with practiced concern, offering to buy her coffee and asking if there was anything he could do to help with what was obviously a stressful situation. His voice was warm and paternal as he introduced himself as a local businessman who enjoyed mentoring promising students, and Arya was immediately struck by his genuine interest in her studies and career goals. When she hesitantly explained her laptop crisis and financial pressures, Richard listened with the kind of focused attention she hadn't experienced since leaving her family in Mumbai, and his sympathy felt like a lifeline in her ocean of isolation and stress. Richard's offer to help was presented so casually that Arya almost missed its significance at first, as he mentioned knowing a computer repair shop that could fix her laptop quickly and affordably. When Arya worried about the cost, Richard waved away her concerns with the easy generosity of someone for whom money was never a consideration, explaining that he considered supporting education and investment in the community's future. The laptop was repaired within hours rather than the weeks Arya had been quoted elsewhere, and when she tried to reimburse Richard, he refused payment with a smile that made her feel both grateful and slightly uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite understand. Their second meeting happened 3 days later when Richard appeared at the coffee shop during Arya's usual study time, claiming he was in the area for a business meeting and thought he would check on how her laptop was working. The conversation flowed naturally as Richard asked intelligent questions about her computer science projects and shared stories about his own business challenges that made him seem relatable despite their obvious differences in age and wealth. Arya found herself laughing for the first time in weeks as Richard described his struggles learning to use modern technology in his traditional business, and his self-deprecating humor put her at ease in a way that reminded her of conversations with her father back home. When Richard suggested they continue their conversation over dinner at a nice restaurant, Arya hesitated because she knew she couldn't afford to split the bill at the type of establishment Richard probably frequented. Reading her concern, Richard quickly clarified that he would be honored to treat her to dinner as a small celebration of her academic achievements and a chance to learn more about her experiences as an international student. The restaurant he chose was elegant but not intimidating, and Richard's respectful behavior throughout the evening made Arya feel like she was dining with a sophisticated uncle rather than a man with potentially romantic intentions. During dinner, Richard revealed more about his background and his genuine interest in helping ambitious young people achieve their goals, mentioning several other students he had mentored over the years who had gone on to successful careers. He spoke knowledgeably about the challenges international students faced and seemed to understand the unique pressures Arya experienced being so far from her family support system. When Richard offered to introduce her to some of his business contacts who might have internship opportunities, Arya felt a surge of hope that her American dream might actually be achievable with the right connections and support. The gifts started small and seemed innocent enough that Arya convinced herself they were simply expressions of Richard's generous nature and commitment to supporting her education. A set of expensive textbooks she had mentioned needing, a gift card to the campus bookstore, money for a winter coat suitable for Florida's surprisingly cold snaps that her family in tropical Mumbai hadn't anticipated. Each gift came with rational explanations about investing in her success and ensuring she had the tools necessary to excel in her demanding program, and Richard's paternal manner made accepting his generosity feel natural rather than transactional. Richard's knowledge of Arya's daily routine became increasingly detailed as he seemed to appear at convenient moments when she was struggling with particular challenges or feeling especially lonely and homesick. He knew when she had difficult exams coming up and would surprise her with care packages containing her favorite Indian snacks that he had somehow tracked down at specialty stores in nearby cities. His attention to these personal details felt caring and thoughtful, but part of Arya began to wonder how he knew so much about her schedule and preferences when she was certain she hadn't shared all of this information with him directly. By November, Richard had become a central figure in Arya's life as their dinner meetings became weekly traditions and his advice influenced her academic and career decisions. He helped her navigate administrative challenges at the university, connected her with tutoring resources for her most difficult classes, and provided emotional support during video calls with her family when language barriers and cultural differences made communication stressful. Arya began to depend on Richard's presence in her life as a source of stability and encouragement that she couldn't find anywhere else in her new environment. Richard's suggestions about Arya's appearance were introduced so gradually that she barely noticed the subtle pressure to dress and present herself in ways that pleased him. He complimented her when she wore certain colors or styles, and his approval became something she unconsciously sought when choosing outfits for their meetings. When he offered to take her shopping for clothes more suitable for professional networking events, Arya accepted because she genuinely needed interview-appropriate attire and couldn't afford the quality pieces Richard suggested she would need to make good impressions in his business circles. The shopping trips revealed Richard's specific preferences for how Arya should look, as he guided her toward elegant but revealing clothing that emphasized her figure in ways that made her slightly uncomfortable but seemed necessary for the professional image he was helping her create. Richard's expertise in fashion and social expectations felt valuable to someone who had grown up in a completely different cultural context, and Arya trusted his judgment about what American businesspeople would expect from a young professional woman seeking opportunities in competitive fields. As December approached and final exams loomed, Richard's support became even more intensive as he offered Arya private study space in one of his downtown offices where she could work without the distractions and noise of her cramped dorm room. The office was a luxurious corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, equipped with high-speed internet, a coffee machine, and comfortable furniture that made studying feel less like torture and more like a privilege she had never imagined accessing. Richard explained that the space was normally used for client meetings but sat empty most evenings, so Arya would be doing him a favor by utilizing it rather than letting it go to waste. The office arrangement allowed Richard to check on Arya's progress more frequently, and his visits became longer and more personal as he would arrive with dinner from expensive restaurants and insist they eat together while discussing her studies and future plans. These intimate dinners in the privacy of his office created a sense of domestic routine that felt simultaneously comforting and slightly inappropriate, though Arya couldn't pinpoint exactly why she felt uncomfortable when Richard was being so helpful and generous with his time and resources. He would sit close beside her as they reviewed her assignments, his hand occasionally resting on her shoulder or back in gestures that seemed supportive but lasted longer than necessary for simple encouragement. Richard's questions about Arya's personal life became more detailed and invasive as he expressed concern about her social isolation and suggested she needed to be more careful about the people she trusted at university. He warned her that other students might be jealous of her academic success and try to sabotage her projects, and that professors sometimes had biases against international students that could affect her grades unfairly. His protective attitude made Arya feel valued and cared for, but it also increased her dependence on his judgment and guidance in situations where she might have previously relied on her own instincts. The first direct proposition came in mid-December when Richard suggested that Arya's living situation was unsuitable for someone of her caliber and potential, pointing out that her noisy dorm environment was hindering her academic performance and social development. He owned a furnished one-bedroom apartment near campus that was currently vacant between tenants, and he offered to let Arya live there rent-free in exchange for what he described as light housekeeping and occasional assistance with his business paperwork. The apartment was beautiful and modern with granite countertops, hardwood floors, and a view of the campus that would make Arya the envy of every student she knew. When Arya hesitated about accepting such an expensive gift, Richard explained that the arrangement would actually benefit him because having a responsible tenant would prevent vandalism and theft that sometimes occurred in vacant properties. He emphasized that Arya would be doing him a favor while also improving her own living conditions and academic performance, framing the offer as a mutually beneficial business arrangement rather than charity that might make her feel uncomfortable. The logic seemed sound, and the opportunity to escape her cramped dorm room was too tempting to refuse when Richard made it seem like a practical solution that helped both of them. Moving into Richard's apartment felt like stepping into a lifestyle Arya had only seen in movies, with a fully equipped kitchen, comfortable furniture, and reliable internet that transformed her daily experience of American student life. The apartment came with implicit rules and expectations that Richard introduced gradually, such as maintaining the space to his exacting standards and being available when he needed assistance with business tasks that required someone with her computer skills. Arya didn't mind these requirements because they seemed reasonable in exchange for free housing that saved her hundreds of dollars monthly. Richard's visits to the apartment became more frequent and personal as he would arrive unannounced to check on maintenance issues or discuss business matters that required Arya's technical assistance. He had keys to the apartment and treated it as his property rather than her temporary home, which created an uncomfortable dynamic where Arya never felt completely private or independent even in her own living space. Richard would comment on her clothing, suggest improvements to her appearance, and express opinions about her study habits and social activities in ways that felt increasingly controlling rather than supportive. The business assistance Richard required became more complex and time-consuming as he involved Arya in creating presentations, managing databases, and handling correspondence that seemed designed to keep her occupied and grateful for the opportunities he was providing. He paid her for this work at rates far above what she could earn at her campus job, which created financial dependence that made it difficult to refuse his requests even when they interfered with her academic schedule. Arya began to realize that Richard's generosity came with strings attached that were becoming more visible and restrictive as their arrangement evolved. If you're feeling as concerned about Arya's situation as I am while telling this heartbreaking story, Please hit that like button because stories like this need to be shared to warn others about the dangerous traps that vulnerable students can fall into. And make sure you subscribe to our channel because we're dedicated to exposing the predatory behavior that destroys young lives when people think no one is watching. Richard's expectations for Arya's availability and attention became more demanding as he suggested that successful professional relationships required dedication and loyalty that went beyond normal business hours. He would call or text at all hours expecting immediate responses, and he became irritated when Arya had commitments that prevented her from being accessible to him whenever he needed her assistance or company. His emotional manipulation was subtle but effective as he would express disappointment about her priorities and remind her of all the opportunities he had provided when she tried to establish boundaries. The isolation from her peers became more pronounced as Richard discouraged Arya from developing friendships with other students, suggesting that they were too immature and frivolous to understand someone of her ambition and potential. He convinced her that spending time with her classmates was a waste of energy that could be better invested in networking with professional contacts who could actually advance her career after graduation. This advice seemed logical coming from someone with Richard's experience and success, but it effectively cut Arya off from potential support systems that might have helped her recognize the unhealthy dynamics developing in their relationship. Richard's physical boundaries began shifting in subtle ways as his casual touches became more intimate and possessive, with his hands lingering on her waist during conversations and his hugs lasting longer than felt comfortable or appropriate. When Arya tried to create distance, Richard would act hurt and confused about her reaction, suggesting that she was being paranoid or culturally misunderstanding normal American business relationships. His ability to make her feel guilty for being uncomfortable with his behavior was masterful psychological manipulation that left Arya doubting her own instincts and cultural understanding. The financial control Richard exercised over Arya's life became total as he suggested she quit her campus job because the work was beneath someone of her capabilities and his business projects provided better income and experience. Without her independent source of income, Arya became completely dependent on Richard's payments for survival, which gave him enormous leverage to control her behavior and decisions. He used this financial dependence to justify his expectations for her time and attention, arguing that employees needed to be available when their employers required their services. Richard's introduction of alcohol during their dinner meetings was presented as sophistication training for someone who would need to navigate professional social events in American business culture. He encouraged Arya to develop a taste for wine and cocktails while explaining the social importance of drinking etiquette in networking situations, but the alcohol made her more vulnerable to his suggestions and less able to maintain the boundaries she was trying to establish. These drinking sessions became regular parts of their routine, and Richard's behavior became more aggressive and inappropriate when Arya was under the influence. The first explicit sexual proposition came during one of these alcohol-influenced evenings when Richard suggested that their professional relationship could evolve into something more personal and mutually satisfying. He framed the suggestion as a natural progression of their connection and emphasized the additional benefits and opportunities that would become available to Arya if she was willing to explore a more intimate arrangement. When Arya expressed shock and discomfort, Richard quickly backed down and apologized, claiming he had misread her signals and respected her boundaries completely. The apology felt sincere enough that Arya convinced herself the incident was a misunderstanding rather than a calculated test of her vulnerability and willingness to comply with his desires. Richard's behavior returned to its previous professional tone for several days, which made Arya question whether she had overreacted to what might have been innocent comments influenced by alcohol and misinterpreted through cultural differences. His ability to normalize inappropriate behavior and make her doubt her own perceptions was a sophisticated manipulation technique that kept her off balance and unsure about what was really happening in their relationship. The holiday break provided a temporary reprieve from Richard's constant presence, but it also highlighted Arya's complete isolation from any support system that might help her process the increasingly uncomfortable dynamics in their relationship. She couldn't afford to travel home to India for the holidays, and Richard was her only social connection in Florida, which made her desperate to maintain their arrangement despite her growing unease about his intentions and behavior. The loneliness during the empty holiday campus made her grateful for Richard's attention even when that attention felt inappropriate or overwhelming. Richard's New Year's Eve invitation seemed innocent enough as he suggested Arya join him at an elegant party with his business associates, presenting it as a networking opportunity that could lead to internship offers and job prospects after graduation. The party was at a luxury hotel downtown, and Richard insisted on buying Arya a sophisticated dress that would help her make the right impression on potential employers who would be attending the event. The dress was more revealing than anything Arya had ever worn, but Richard convinced her that American professional women dressed differently than she was accustomed to in conservative Indian culture. The New Year's Eve party was unlike anything Arya had ever experienced, with elegantly dressed guests mingling in a ballroom decorated with crystal chandeliers and champagne flowing as freely as water while a jazz band played sophisticated music that created the perfect backdrop for networking conversations. Richard introduced Arya to several influential business leaders as his protégé, emphasizing her intelligence and potential in ways that made her feel important and valued in professional circles she had never imagined accessing. The attention from successful executives was intoxicating for someone who had spent months feeling invisible and struggling to find her place in American society, and Richard's pride in presenting her as his discovery made her feel like she was finally achieving the success her family had sacrificed so much to make possible. As the evening progressed and the champagne continued flowing, Richard's behavior became more possessive and intimate as he kept his hand on Arya's lower back while introducing her to contacts and made comments about her beauty and charm that seemed inappropriate for a professional mentoring relationship. Several of the business associates Richard introduced her to made knowing looks and subtle comments that suggested they understood her relationship with Richard to be more personal than professional, which made Arya uncomfortable but confused about how to address the misunderstanding without embarrassing Richard or damaging the networking opportunities he was providing. The hotel suite Richard had reserved for the evening was presented as a practical necessity since the party would end late and Arya shouldn't have to navigate public transportation alone at night in an unfamiliar part of the city. The suite was luxurious with a separate sitting area and bedroom, and Richard assured Arya that he would sleep on the couch while she took the bedroom, maintaining appropriate boundaries while ensuring her safety and comfort. His consideration seemed thoughtful and protective, though Arya noticed that he had packed an overnight bag without asking if she was comfortable with the arrangement. The evening took a darker turn after midnight when Richard's drinking made him more aggressive and direct about his expectations for their relationship, as he cornered Arya in the suite and explained that successful business relationships in America often involved personal intimacy that she might not understand coming from conservative Indian culture. He suggested that her resistance to his advances was cultural naivety that was preventing her from accessing opportunities that could transform her entire future, and that women who wanted to succeed in competitive fields needed to understand how relationships really worked in American business circles. When Arya tried to leave the suite, Richard blocked her path and reminded her of everything he had provided for her, from the apartment and financial support to the networking opportunities and professional contacts that could make or break her career prospects after graduation. His tone became threatening as he suggested that ungrateful protégés who bit the hands that fed them often found themselves struggling without the support systems they had taken for granted. The implicit threat was clear even though Richard never explicitly stated what would happen if Arya refused his advances or tried to end their arrangement. The assault that followed was devastating and brutal as Richard used his physical strength and emotional manipulation to overcome Arya's resistance while convincing her that fighting would only make the situation worse for both of them. He told her that no one would believe her accusations against a respected businessman, and that her student visa status made her vulnerable to deportation if she created problems for important people in the community. The violation felt like the death of every dream she had carried from Mumbai to Florida, and Richard's casual behavior afterward suggested that he considered what had happened a normal progression of their business relationship. Arya's return to campus in January was a nightmare of shame, trauma, and fear as she struggled to focus on her studies while processing what had happened and determining how to survive the remaining months of her program. Richard continued contacting her regularly as if nothing had changed, expecting her to maintain their previous arrangement and threatening consequences if she tried to distance herself from their relationship. The apartment that had once felt like a luxury now felt like a prison where she was constantly on edge waiting for Richard's unannounced visits and demands for her time and attention. The isolation became complete as Arya felt unable to confide in anyone about her situation, knowing that her conservative family would be devastated by the shame and that university authorities might not believe her accusations against such a prominent community member. Richard had carefully constructed their relationship to appear consensual and mutually beneficial, with documentation of payments for business assistance and gifts that could be interpreted as compensation for services rather than evidence of exploitation. His sophistication in covering his tracks made Arya feel helpless and trapped in a situation with no clear path to escape or justice. Richard's escalating demands for sexual compliance were disguised as relationship progression and business necessity as he introduced her to other wealthy men in his network who expected similar arrangements with young women seeking career advancement. He framed these encounters as networking opportunities that would expand her professional contacts and increase her value in the job market after graduation. But Arya understood that she was being used as a sexual commodity in Richard's business relationships. The realization that she had become part of a systematic exploitation network was almost more devastating than the individual violations. The academic pressure combined with trauma made it nearly impossible for Arya to maintain her grades and complete assignments that required concentration and creativity she no longer possessed. Her professors noticed her declining performance but attributed it to typical international student adjustment issues rather than recognizing signs of abuse and exploitation that were hidden behind her attempts to maintain a normal appearance. The fear of academic failure added another layer of stress to her already overwhelming situation, as losing her student status would mean deportation and a complete failure of her family's dreams and sacrifices. If this heartbreaking story is making you realize how vulnerable international students can be to predators who exploit their isolation and desperation, please hit that like button to help us spread awareness about these dangerous situations. And make sure you subscribe because we're committed to exposing the truth about how innocent dreams can become deadly nightmares when people have no one to protect them. Richard's control over Arya's life became total as he monitored her communications, controlled her finances, and isolated her from any potential support systems that might help her escape or seek help. He installed tracking apps on her phone under the guise of ensuring her safety, and he had keys to the apartment that allowed him to appear whenever he wanted to assert his ownership and control over her living situation. The psychological manipulation was so complete that Arya began to believe that her situation was somehow her fault and that she had brought this exploitation on herself by accepting Richard's initial help and gifts. The breaking point came in March when Richard informed Arya that he was planning to expand their arrangement by introducing her to a network of wealthy older men who regularly paid for companionship from young international women seeking career advancement. He presented this as a lucrative opportunity that would provide her with financial security and professional connections that could last long after graduation. But Arya understood that he was essentially proposing to traffic her to other predators who would use and abuse her in similar ways. The horror of realizing that Richard saw her as a commodity to be shared and sold to other men finally broke through the psychological conditioning that had kept her compliant and hopeful that their arrangement was somehow beneficial to her future. She understood that he had never intended to help her succeed professionally, but had instead been grooming her for sexual exploitation that would continue as long as she remained under his control. The recognition that she was trapped in a human trafficking situation rather than a mentoring relationship gave her the clarity to understand that she needed to escape regardless of the consequences. Arya's first attempt to seek help came through a campus counseling service, but her fear of deportation and Richard's threats made it difficult to explain her situation clearly or provide the kind of evidence that would convince authorities to take action against such a prominent community member. The counselor was sympathetic but explained that without clear evidence of criminal activity or immediate physical danger, there were limited resources available to help international students in complicated personal situations. The bureaucratic response left Arya feeling more hopeless and isolated than ever. Richard's reaction to Arya's attempt to seek help was swift and terrifying as he somehow learned about her counseling session and confronted her with rage about her disloyalty and ingratitude after everything he had provided for her. He threatened to destroy her academically and professionally by contacting her professors and future employers with damaging information about her character and reliability, and he reminded her that her family in India would be devastated if they learned about her shameful behavior in America. His ability to know about her private counseling session revealed the extent of his surveillance and control over her life. The escalation of Richard's threats included explicit descriptions of violence that would befall young women who betrayed the trust of powerful men, and he showed Arya news articles about international students who had disappeared or been found dead in circumstances that were never fully investigated by authorities. His message was clear that she was expendable and that her death would be easily explained as a tragic accident or suicide by a struggling international student who couldn't handle the pressures of American academic life. Arya's desperation reached a crisis point when Richard announced that she would be accompanying him to a weekend retreat with his business associates. where she would be expected to entertain multiple men in ways that would demonstrate her gratitude for the opportunities she had received. The prospect of being gang-raped by Richard's associates while he profited from her abuse finally gave Arya the motivation to risk everything in an attempt to escape, even if it meant deportation, academic failure, and bringing shame to her family who had sacrificed everything for her American education. The planning for her escape required careful coordination and timing as Arya realized she would need to disappear completely from Richard's surveillance and control before he could retaliate against her or carry out his threats of violence. She began secretly gathering important documents, cash, and evidence of Richard's exploitation while pretending to comply with his demands and maintain their normal routine. The fear of discovery made every day feel like a countdown to either freedom or death, as Arya knew that Richard would not allow her to leave his control without consequences that could destroy her life or end it entirely. Arya's opportunity for escape came during a rare moment when Richard was traveling to Miami for a business conference, giving her a 3-day window to execute a plan she had been secretly developing for weeks while pretending to remain compliant with his increasingly dangerous demands. She had managed to contact her cousin Preet, who lived in Orlando, through a borrowed phone at the campus library, carefully explaining her situation without revealing the full extent of Richard's abuse because she was too ashamed to admit how completely she had been manipulated and exploited. Preet immediately offered to help despite not fully understanding the severity of Arya's predicament, agreeing to drive to Gainesville and provide transportation to a safe location where Arya could figure out her next steps. The escape itself was terrifying and rushed as Arya gathered only essential documents and a small bag of clothes while constantly watching for any sign that Richard might return early or that his surveillance network might alert him to her activities. She had discovered cameras hidden throughout the apartment during her weeks of careful observation, so she moved quickly and deliberately to avoid creating suspicion about her intentions while she waited for Preet's arrival. The fear that Richard might appear at any moment made every minute feel like an eternity, and Arya's hands shook so badly she could barely pack the few possessions she could safely take without alerting him to her plans. Preet's arrival at the designated meeting spot behind the campus library was both relief and terror for Arya, who understood that this moment marked the point of no return in her relationship with Richard and would trigger consequences she couldn't fully predict or control. The 3-hour drive to Orlando gave Arya time to explain more details about her situation to Preet, whose shock and anger about Richard's exploitation helped Arya understand that her experiences were not normal mentoring relationships but systematic abuse that had isolated her from reality and normal human connections. The women's shelter in Orlando where Preet took Arya was staffed by advocates who specialized in helping trafficking victims, and their immediate recognition of Arya's situation as human trafficking rather than a complicated relationship provided validation that helped her understand the true nature of what Richard had done to her. The intake counselor explained that Richard's methods were classic grooming and trafficking techniques designed to create dependence and compliance in vulnerable young women, and that Arya's experience followed patterns they had seen in dozens of similar cases involving international students and wealthy predators who exploited immigration vulnerabilities. The legal complexities of Arya's situation became apparent as advocates explained that her student visa status made reporting Richard's crimes risky because immigration authorities might view her involvement as voluntary prostitution rather than trafficking, potentially leading to deportation regardless of her victim status. The advocates worked with specialized immigration attorneys who understood how trafficking laws intersected with student visa regulations, but the process would be lengthy and uncertain with no guarantee that Arya would be allowed to remain in the United States even if Richard was successfully prosecuted for his crimes. Richard's reaction to discovering Arya's disappearance was immediate and terrifying as he began a systematic campaign to locate and punish her for what he viewed as theft of his property and betrayal of their business arrangement. He contacted the university claiming that Arya had stolen money and property from his business, and he filed police reports alleging that she had violated the terms of their housing agreement and destroyed his apartment before disappearing with valuable items. His ability to manipulate official channels and present himself as a victim rather than a predator demonstrated the sophistication of his criminal enterprise and his experience in controlling the narrative when his victims tried to escape. The threats against Arya escalated through intermediaries as Richard used his business network to search for her location while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement in what appeared to be legitimate efforts to recover stolen property from a dishonest employee. Private investigators began appearing at locations where Arya might seek help, and her cousin Preet received anonymous phone calls warning about the consequences of harboring fugitives who had committed crimes against respected businessmen. The psychological warfare was designed to isolate Arya from potential supporters and create fear that would drive her back to Richard's control. Arya's academic status became another weapon in Richard's arsenal as he contacted her professors and university administrators with carefully crafted stories about her unprofessional behavior and unreliability that cast doubt on her character and academic integrity. He suggested that her disappearance was evidence of psychological instability that made her unsuitable for continued enrollment, and he offered to provide character references that would support administrative decisions to terminate her student visa for academic or behavioral violations. The threat to her education was devastating because losing her student status would mean automatic deportation and the complete failure of her family's dreams and sacrifices. The revelation that Richard's trafficking network included other international students became apparent when shelter advocates connected Arya with other young women who had escaped similar situations with wealthy men throughout Florida's university system. These women shared stories that were heartbreakingly similar to Arya's experience, involving initial mentoring relationships that evolved into sexual exploitation disguised as career advancement opportunities. The systematic nature of the operation revealed that Richard was part of a larger criminal enterprise that specifically targeted vulnerable international students for trafficking purposes. The psychological impact of understanding that she had been selected and groomed as part of a systematic criminal operation rather than being involved in a unique relationship was devastating for Arya's sense of self-worth and judgment. The knowledge that Richard had never seen her as a person with potential but rather as a commodity to be exploited challenged every assumption she had made about their interactions and her own ability to recognize danger and manipulation. The shame and self-blame were overwhelming despite counselors' explanations that trafficking victims are specifically targeted for their positive qualities rather than their weaknesses. Law enforcement's response to Arya's situation was complicated by jurisdictional issues and the difficulty of prosecuting wealthy defendants who had carefully constructed legal facades for their criminal activities. The FBI's trafficking unit expressed interest in building a case against Richard's network, but they explained that successful prosecution would require testimony from multiple victims and extensive documentation of the criminal enterprise that could take years to develop. Arya's willingness to cooperate as a witness would be crucial, but it would also mean remaining in the United States throughout a lengthy legal process with no guarantee of a successful outcome. If you're feeling as outraged as I am about how these predators systematically target and destroy innocent young people's lives, please hit that like button to help expose these criminal networks that operate in plain sight. And make sure you subscribe because we're committed to bringing you the truth about how traffickers use legitimate businesses and communities standing to hide their crimes from authorities who should be protecting vulnerable victims. The decision to cooperate with federal investigators was agonizing for Arya because it meant accepting that her academic dreams were permanently derailed and that she would need to rebuild her entire life around the trauma Richard had inflicted rather than the career goals she had carried from Mumbai to Florida. The thought of explaining to her family why she would not be completing her degree or returning home as planned was almost unbearable, especially knowing that her parents had sacrificed their financial security to provide opportunities that had been corrupted into a nightmare beyond their comprehension. Richard's escalating desperation to silence Arya became apparent through increased surveillance and intimidation tactics that suggested he understood the potential consequences if she succeeded in exposing his criminal network to federal authorities. Private investigators began following Preet and other family members, and anonymous threats were delivered to the shelter where Arya was staying, creating an atmosphere of fear that extended beyond Arya herself to everyone who tried to help her escape and seek justice. The media attention surrounding Arya's case began when advocacy organizations decided to publicize her story as an example of how trafficking operations targeted international students through seemingly legitimate mentoring relationships. The publicity was necessary to build public pressure for stronger protections for vulnerable students, but it also increased the danger to Arya by making her location and cooperation with authorities more visible to Richard's network. The balance between seeking justice and maintaining safety became increasingly precarious as the case gained prominence. Arya's testimony to federal investigators revealed the extent of Richard's criminal enterprise, including financial records, communication evidence, and details about other victims who had been trafficked through his network over several years. The evidence was compelling enough for prosecutors to begin building cases against Richard and his associates, But the legal process would be lengthy and uncertain, with no guarantee that Arya would be safe from retaliation throughout the proceedings. The impact on Arya's family in Mumbai was devastating when they finally learned the truth about why their daughter would not be completing her education or returning home as planned, and their guilt about sending her to America alone compounded the trauma of understanding how completely they had misunderstood her situation during their weekly phone calls. Their anger and desire for justice were tempered by fear for Arya's continued safety and uncertainty about whether the American legal system would actually protect their daughter or expose her to further harm from wealthy criminals with extensive resources. The solidarity Arya found with other trafficking survivors provided crucial emotional support during the legal process, but it also revealed the long-term psychological and practical consequences of escaping trafficking situations that extended far beyond the immediate physical danger. Many survivors struggled with depression, anxiety, and trust issues that affected their ability to form healthy relationships and pursue normal career and educational goals, suggesting that Arya's recovery would be a lifelong process rather than a simple return to her previous aspirations. Richard's attempts to discredit Arya's testimony included hiring expensive attorneys who portrayed her as an opportunistic immigrant who had voluntarily engaged in prostitution and was now trying to extort money from a successful businessman through false accusations. The legal strategy relied on cultural stereotypes about international students and sex work that made Arya's credibility dependent on convincing judges and juries that trafficking victims could be intelligent, educated women rather than stereotypical vulnerable runaways from dysfunctional backgrounds. The federal investigation that followed Arya's testimony uncovered a trafficking network far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, with Richard Sterling at the center of an operation that had exploited over 30 international students across Florida's university system over a 5-year period. Financial records revealed payments to corrupt university officials who provided Richard with access to vulnerable students' personal information, and digital evidence showed systematic grooming techniques that followed identical patterns with each victim. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked even experienced trafficking investigators who had thought they understood the sophistication of modern sexual exploitation operations targeting educated young women rather than traditional trafficking demographics. Richard's arrest in June 2024 was dramatic and public as federal agents surrounded his luxury office building during a business meeting with potential new victims, ensuring maximum media coverage that would encourage other survivors to come forward with testimony. The charges included multiple counts of human trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, and immigration fraud, with potential sentences that could result in life imprisonment if prosecutors succeeded in proving the full extent of his criminal activities. Richard's shock at being arrested revealed his genuine belief that his wealth and community standing provided immunity from consequences, and his immediate demands for expensive legal representation demonstrated his continued confidence that money could solve his legal problems. The legal proceedings that followed were grueling for Arya and other survivors who testified about their experiences, as Richard's defense team employed every possible strategy to discredit their testimony and portray the trafficking as consensual prostitution entered into voluntarily by opportunistic young women seeking easy money. The courtroom became a battleground where Arya's credibility, character, and cultural background were scrutinized and attacked in ways that felt like additional violations of her dignity and privacy. Defense attorneys argued that intelligent, educated women like Arya should have recognized and avoided the situation if it was truly exploitative, placing blame on victims rather than acknowledging the sophisticated psychological manipulation that made escape nearly impossible. The support network that developed among trafficking survivors during the trial provided crucial emotional strength for women who had been systematically isolated and convinced that their experiences were unique and shameful. Sharing stories with other survivors helped Arya understand that Richard's techniques were calculated criminal methods rather than personal failures on her part, and the collective testimony of multiple victims created a powerful narrative that prosecutors used to demonstrate the systematic nature of Richard's trafficking operation. The courage these women showed in testifying despite threats and intimidation became a source of inspiration for other trafficking survivors considering whether to report their experiences. Richard's conviction on all charges in September 2024 was a victory for trafficking survivors throughout Florida, but the 35-year federal prison sentence felt inadequate given the devastating impact his crimes had on dozens of young women whose lives and dreams had been permanently altered by his exploitation. The financial restitution ordered by the court provided some compensation for medical expenses and lost educational opportunities, But no amount of money could restore the innocence, trust, and sense of safety that Richard had stolen from his victims through years of systematic abuse disguised as mentoring and career advancement. The ripple effects of Richard's prosecution extended throughout Florida's business and university communities as other wealthy men involved in similar exploitation schemes fled the state or dramatically altered their behavior to avoid scrutiny from federal investigators who were now actively monitoring relationships between older businessmen and young international students. University administrators implemented new policies requiring background checks for any community members seeking regular access to international student populations, and mandatory training programs were established to help students recognize grooming behaviors and exploitation tactics that masqueraded as legitimate mentoring relationships. Arya's decision to remain in the United States as a key witness in ongoing trafficking investigations required enormous courage as she faced continued threats from associates of Richard's network who blamed her for destroying a profitable criminal enterprise. The federal witness protection resources provided some security, but Arya understood that her visibility as an advocate for trafficking survivors would always make her a target for retaliation from criminals who profited from the silence and shame of their victims. Her transformation from victim to survivor to advocate represented a journey of healing that inspired other young women facing similar exploitation to seek help rather than suffer in isolation. The completion of Arya's computer science degree through an accelerated program designed for trafficking survivors was a powerful symbol of resilience and determination as she reclaimed the educational dreams that Richard had attempted to destroy through his exploitation and manipulation. Her graduation ceremony was attended by family members who had traveled from Mumbai to celebrate not just her academic achievement but her survival of an ordeal that had tested every aspect of her strength and character. The degree represented not just professional qualification but proof that traffickers could not permanently destroy the potential and ambition of their victims. Arya's new career working with federal agencies to identify and disrupt trafficking networks targeting international students provided meaningful purpose from her traumatic experiences as she used her first-hand knowledge to protect other vulnerable young women from predators who exploited their dreams and desperation. Her work involved developing educational programs, training law enforcement personnel, and providing direct support to survivors who were navigating the complex legal and immigration systems that could either protect or endanger trafficking victims depending on how their cases were handled by authorities. The ongoing investigation into Richard's criminal network continued, uncovering additional victims and criminal associates as digital evidence revealed connections to trafficking operations in other states and countries, suggesting that Arya's case was part of an international criminal enterprise that specifically targeted educated young women from developing countries seeking opportunities in Western universities. The global scope of the trafficking network emphasized how Richard's individual crimes were connected to larger systems of exploitation that required international cooperation and comprehensive legal reforms to address effectively. If this powerful story of survival and justice has moved you to understand how predators systematically target vulnerable students through legitimate-seeming opportunities, please hit that like button to help us spread awareness that could protect other young people from falling into these deadly traps. And make sure you subscribe to our channel because we're committed to exposing the truth about how traffickers operate and how survivors can rebuild their lives after escaping exploitation. The psychological healing process for Arya and other survivors was ongoing and complex as they worked with specialized therapists to address trauma symptoms that affected their ability to trust others, form healthy relationships, and pursue normal career and personal goals without constant fear of manipulation and exploitation. The therapy revealed how trafficking had altered their fundamental beliefs about safety, relationships, and their own worth in ways that required years of patient work to restore, but the progress each survivor made provided hope that complete healing was possible with proper support and determination. Richard's attempts to appeal his conviction were unsuccessful as appellate courts upheld both the guilty verdicts and the lengthy prison sentence, finding that the evidence of systematic trafficking was overwhelming and that the sentence was appropriate given the severity and scope of his crimes against vulnerable young women. His appeals attorneys continued portraying him as a victim of vindictive prosecution by ambitious federal prosecutors, but the detailed evidence of his criminal enterprise made these arguments implausible to judges who understood the sophisticated nature of modern trafficking operations. The legislative changes inspired by Arya's case included new federal protections for international students who report trafficking crimes, ensuring that their immigration status would be protected during criminal proceedings and that they would have pathways to permanent residency as trafficking survivors rather than facing deportation after cooperating with law enforcement. These legal reforms addressed one of the primary weapons traffickers used to maintain control over international student victims who feared that seeking help would result in immediate removal from the United States. The educational initiatives developed in response to trafficking cases like Arya's included mandatory orientation programs for international students that specifically addressed the tactics used by predators who targeted vulnerable newcomers through seemingly legitimate offers of mentoring, housing, and career assistance. These programs taught students to recognize grooming behaviors, understand their legal rights, and access resources for help without fear of immigration consequences, creating knowledge and support systems that could prevent future students from falling prey to sophisticated trafficking operations. Arya's advocacy work extended to speaking at universities throughout the United States, where she shared her story with international student populations and administrators who needed to understand how trafficking operated within their communities. Her presentations were powerful and educational as she explained how intelligent, motivated students could be systematically manipulated by criminals who understood their vulnerabilities and exploited their dreams of success in America. The response from audiences was consistently supportive and grateful as people realized how easily they or their loved ones could fall victim to similar schemes. The ongoing support network Arya developed with other trafficking survivors became a source of strength and purpose as they worked together to help newly rescued victims navigate the complex process of healing and rebuilding their lives after escaping exploitation. Their collective wisdom and experience provided invaluable guidance for survivors who were struggling with shame, fear, and uncertainty about their futures, demonstrating that recovery was possible and that their experiences could be transformed into powerful tools for protecting and helping others. The final resolution of Arya's immigration status came when she received permanent residency as a trafficking survivor, allowing her to build a secure future in the United States without fear of deportation and providing the stability necessary to continue her advocacy work and personal healing process. Her success in obtaining legal status encouraged other trafficking survivors to cooperate with law enforcement and pursue immigration relief, knowing that the legal system could protect rather than punish victims who had the courage to seek justice against their traffickers. Today, Arya Mehta continues her work protecting international students from trafficking while building a life defined by purpose, healing, and hope rather than trauma and fear. Her story serves as both a warning about the sophisticated tactics used by modern traffickers and an inspiration about the strength of survivors who refuse to let their experiences define their futures. Through her courage in speaking out, Arya has saved countless other young women from similar fates and proven that justice is possible even against wealthy, powerful predators who believe their money and status make them untouchable.